Good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine Robb, Chair of the Future Forum, a membership group here at the LBJ Library, and it's my honor to welcome you all here tonight. We are thrilled to have the opportunity to hear from Mark Halperin and John Heilemann, authors of Game Change, Obama and the Clintons, McCain and Palin, and the Race of a Lifetime. Game Change has been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction for the last 6 weeks. It's been called the hottest book in the country, compulsively readable, and an absolute page-turner by critics around the country. And I suspect with this audience, a lot of y'all have already read it. But for those of you that have not, I feel pretty sure that after tonight, you're going to run home with your books you purchased tonight and start reading immediately, because it really is exciting. Tonight's discussion is sponsored by the LBJ Library, the Texas Book Festival, Texas Tribune, and the Center for Politics and Governance at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And we appreciate y'all's support of all of those, or any or all of those institutions. We promise a lively discussion, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. First, one piece of business. Before I turn the program over to Evan, I want to ask you all to please make sure your cell phones are turned off for the program. So go ahead and do that now if you haven't done that already, please. Guiding the conversation tonight is the wonderful and I can't even say it now, I'm going to get all nervous, indefatigable Evan Smith, a dear friend to so many of us, currently the CEO and editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune, and we are thrilled to have him and our speakers here this evening. Please welcome them.
Thank you. Indefatigable. That's good. Wow, nice to see a full house. Thank you, Catherine. It's always an honor to be in your grandfather's house. Thank you for having us and hosting us tonight. Good evening, everybody. Let me add my welcome on behalf of the Texas Tribune, the LBJ Library, and our partners in presenting this event tonight, the Texas Book Festival and the Center for Politics and Governance at UT Austin's LBJ School of Public Affairs. I don't want to waste any time getting into the program, so let me keep the introduction of our guests brief. Mark Halperin and John Heilemann are the co-authors of Game Change, Obama and the Clintons, McCain and Palin, and the Race of a Lifetime, which debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and as you heard from Catherine, has remained in the top slot ever since. More than 600,000 copies of the book, which is now in its 12th printing, are in circulation. So much for the death of the publishing industry. Given the authors and the material, it was destined to be, and it certainly turned out to be, the only book you'll ever need to read about the 2008 presidential campaign. Filled with insider tales of, yes, history in the making, but also narcissistic nominees, operative backstabbing, out-of-control spouses, rampant adultery, and cussing. Lots of cussing. Was actually considering doing a dramatic reading of the chapter on John McCain's entry into the campaign, but this is a federal institution. I could end up in indecency Gitmo if I do that. So it's hard to imagine, or maybe not hard to imagine, why HBO bought the movie rights before the book was even published. I'm thinking Will Smith as Obama and James Caan as John McCain, but I don't get a vote. Mark should be well known to the insiders and wannabe insiders in the room, having authored for many years as the political director of ABC News, the daily political digest and tip sheet known as The Note. More recently, for nearly the last 3 years, as editor-at-large and senior political analyst for Time magazine, he's been the author, producer, and not-so-hidden hand behind The Page, which matches The Note pound for pound in all of its clubby, shorthand, take-it-to-the-bank authoritative splendor. Mark is the author of The Undecided Voter's Guide to the Next President and the co-author with John Harris of The Way to Win, Taking the White House in 2008. John Heilemann, no slouch, certainly in his own right, is the national political correspondent for New York Magazine, where he's established himself as one of a handful of columnists always worth reading, and where he's written of late about everything from Obamacare to Scott Brown. A former staff writer for The New Yorker, Wired, and The Economist, John is the author of Pride Before the Fall, The Trials of Bill Gates. They made a special trip to Austin, which they wanted to do, a city they love, to be with us tonight, and they're here with their wonderful and very pleasant wives. We're glad to have them here, too. Please join me in welcoming our friends Mark Halperin and John Heilemann. Thank you. Thank you. Guys, how are you?
We're excellent. We want to thank the hosts and correct one thing you said, which is we're here for this, but also to eat breakfast at Cisco's.
Is that it? Well, a table awaits you.
We have an ulterior motive.
And you will smell great all the way on the plane going back, I'm sure.
Please put your biscuits in the overhead.
We'll do that. So I'm remembering a time that we ran into one another in California in the summer of '08 when you were in the middle of all this and thinking this is going to be a great book. But I don't know that any of us fully appreciated the narrative arc of this until it was all over. And it seems to me that this material was just too irresistible to pass up. Did you have that sense all the way along? Did it occur to you all at one moment? Where was the point at which you said this is great?
You know, Evan, when we saw you that day in L.A., you were eating pizza.
I was.
Aggressively.
I was. As all other things, right.
And, you know, the funny thing about that was, of course, as much as we thought already to that point, I think we had only decided to do the book a couple months earlier. Mark and I had been, covering the campaign pretty obsessively over the course of 2007, 2008. And in that spring was when we kind of decided that we would do the book, much in contravention of the prevailing wisdom that, campaigns books were dead and the genre was over.
Right.
We looked at these characters and thought, these are not people who are just interesting for politics, like John Kerry. These are actually interesting people. And the kind of people who could be on the cover of People magazine or on Oprah.
Right.
And there was a reason why the country was riveted in the way that they were and that we were riveted. We thought it was the campaign of a lifetime, and we thought, if we could write a book that showed how these people experienced, lived this campaign and took out the pollsters and the strategists and the tactics and tried to focus on the humanity of it, that might be something that would be worth doing and that people would be interested in even a year later. And I'll tell you, as exciting as we thought it was, when we saw you that day for pizza, there was one huge thing that hadn't even happened yet that would change the arc of the book enormously.
Right.
Sarah Palin. So it only got better from that point on.
In fact, someone who reads only the first half of this book gets just the Obama-Clinton piece. You really don't get the Republicans. You don't get McCain. You don't get Palin. And in and of itself, the Obama-Clinton piece was book-worthy.
Well, we knew from the beginning that would be the heart of the book.
Right.
There are two kinds of cities in America. There's ones where you mention Sarah Palin and everyone feels uplifted, and then there's Austin where everyone laughs, or at least a lot of you laugh. So there was a good chance that the general election would be kind of like coda, that it would be Obama versus McCain, and nothing much would happen.
Yeah.
They would pick, Tim Pawlenty and Tim Kaine as their running mates, but not only the selection of Sarah Palin, which obviously animated for both the country and the world, and for our book, the second half, the general election, but also the selection of Joe Biden was a more interesting thing than you would have seen. And as we report in the book, the behind-the-scenes relationship between Biden and Obama was in some ways as interesting, as more interesting than the relationship between McCain and
just
Palin.
Not as visible to all of us out here.
And the other thing was the financial crisis, which, in a campaign where the heart, and in a book where the heart is the relationship, the arc of the relationship between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama is really the emotional core of the thing. The economic crisis was a huge substantive story, but also a huge political story. It's rare to have 2 months before Election Day a real-time test for everyone to see of how the candidates will do. And that chapter of the book hasn't gotten as much attention as some other things, but we think it's both a revealing chapter and a really a textured and interesting development.
Well, let's, for the benefit of the people here, many people in the audience have read the book, but even for those who haven't, just sort of give us let's stay on that point, because I think you're right. That's a much more interesting chapter than it's gotten credit for. So talk a little bit about what we learned about McCain and Obama before we go back to the beginning from that chapter.
Well, I think, as Mark said, it was a real-time test. And I mean, the first thing that I think is that's surprising about that chapter is that it opens in Chicago with Obama actually crashing a meeting of some of his senior advisors. He wasn't invited, but he showed up. This is right after McCain is on a high from Palin mania, where the bad stuff about Palin hadn't started to happen yet. And McCain is ahead by 3 or 4 points in the national polls, right, much to the dismay of a lot of Democrats who can't believe that Obama is screwing this up. Obama is much cooler about the whole thing, but in this meeting, he's on the phone all day long with people he'd been talking to a lot, a couple of very important Wall Street players, but also Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, and he had gotten word from New York, where the final negotiations over whether Lehman was going to go under or not. He'd heard basically that Lehman was going down the next day, yep. And so he says to these advisors in the room, he says, "I can't really tell you what's going to happen, but tomorrow something's going to happen that's going to totally change the game. We're going to be on the economy probably for the rest of this campaign. It's a very volatile situation. We could lose this thing." I found that when we first heard this in our reporting, I found it kind of astonishing because, for a lot of people, they look back on it and said, oh, this was a Democratic year. Right. They had it locked up. Obama, very confident throughout the campaign, not that confident at that moment. And what transpires after Lehman falls is, Obama, with his relationships with people like Paulson and Bernanke, talking to these people all day long, all night long, taking essentially a graduate seminar in financial economics. He had not been that good on the economy through most of the campaign, did not have any real expertise in these areas, but approached the thing in a way that was both good politics and good policy, really kind of trying to understand what was going on, trying to be responsible, not trying to demagogue the situation. McCain, not.
Yeah, nicely played.
Also someone who didn't understand the economy very well and had a lot of times where his chief economic advisor, Doug Holtz-Eakin, kept telling him, it's okay that you don't understand the economy. You have to stop saying that you don't understand the economy. That's important, right? Right. And McCain says a series of things over the course of that week that are very devastating to him politically, including the fundamentals of the economy are strong. He's going back and forth on whether to fire Chris Cox, about whether there should be a bailout of AIG. By the end of that week, he's starting to look like the caricature of him that the Obama campaign wanted to paint, which was that he was erratic and scattered. And you then get to the core of the chapter, which is when he decides to suspend his campaign and go to Washington. Contrary to his assertion the other day, demanding of George Bush. He says George Bush demanded that he have this meeting. George Bush wanted nothing to do with this meeting because he thought McCain was just coming to Washington to screw everything up. But McCain insisted on the meeting. And then before Bush could even agree, he's saying to his staff in the White House, go and find out what this is all about. Right. McCain's on TV announcing that the meeting is happening, that Bush has invited them to the White House. So, the reporting we did on the White House meeting itself, I think, is people now widely know McCain sat like a bump on the log, not really saying anything, even though he had requested the meeting. Right. Obama takes control of the meeting to such an extent that a Republican source of ours said, if you closed your eyes, you would have thought that Barack Obama was the president of the United States at that moment. He was dominating the meeting to such an extent. Yep. But and I'll close with this. My favorite thing about the whole thing was that McCain was not just a bump on the log, but he was a bump on the log probably because he had totally not prepared for this meeting. Unlike, again, Obama, who'd prepared and gotten his ducks in a row with the congressional leadership. McCain arrives at the meeting with a congressional aide that he has to bring with him because he was not allowed to have any of his campaign people in the room because of federal law. So John Boehner loans him a congressional aide to be his body guy essentially in the room. And this young aide understands the TARP question very well, and as they're riding to the White House together, he's thinking McCain's going to want to know, what should I be saying? Let's say McCain's not that well briefed on this. He's going to want to prepare, bone up. McCain says not a word in the car. He's talking on the phone with Cindy about what they're going to have for dinner that night. And they get to the White House, and they get out of the car, and they walk over to the North Portico, and McCain, who called this meeting, demanded that this meeting take place, and now is arriving for the meeting, turns to this young aide and says, what do I need to know about this meeting? To me, actually, that says almost everything you need to know about John McCain.
Snapshot of the campaign. Now, Mark, from a process standpoint, the reporting that John has just trotted out for us is done for this book in real time or after some time has passed in retrospect?
We did a lot of reporting. Tell me if I'm answering the question you asked. We did a lot of reporting immediately after the nomination fights were settled. Right. And then a lot immediately after the general election. It's a strange thing to do a project of this scope in this day and age when so much of journalism is instantaneous.
Immediate,
with very little reporting. This was more old-fashioned, over 300 interviews with over 200 people, and long interviews. And to get people in the midst of a campaign or in the immediate aftermath of a campaign, if they've lost, they want to go on vacation and never think about it again. If they've won, they're planning the government. To get them to sit for this period of time required drawing on professional relationships that for us spanned, in some cases, 20 years. And it required them to be willing to participate in a long way. We interviewed some of the most important people involved in this story over half a dozen times. Mm-hmm. Some of the interviews lasted 5, 6, 7 hours. There were bathroom breaks. And we got them to talk about the things that had happened. Incredibly important to do the interviews about the nomination season immediately after it ended, because the human memory is got an extraordinarily small half-life. And even as we did interviews having to go back and fill in the blanks from the earlier stuff, in the second round, it was clear how much people had forgotten.
The level of detail in the book is so extraordinary that it seems as if it must have been fresh. There couldn't have been any way to get that level of detail had it not been. But the process that you described, 300 people in all these interviews, you make a point in the introduction to the book in talking about how this is a little non-traditional from a sourcing standpoint, that you don't really reveal in the course of the text, so-and-so told you this. You've just sort of seemed to put it together seamlessly as a narrative. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, I'd say it's really not non-traditional. It's something that's been done a lot. Barbarians at the Gate is written in that style. Bob Woodward's books are written in that style. Probably the best political book of modern times, at least, What It Takes by Richard Ben Kramer. And it's important, if you do a book in this style, to use a really high bar for what you put in it.
Right.
So if someone told us a story, I was at this meeting with 5 people, and they told us the best story you'd ever hear in your life, and the other people in the meeting didn't remember it that way, we didn't put it in the book. If you were using a different standard, you could write in a different style of writing. You could say, this meeting took place and one participant remembered X, Y, and Z.